There is a particular quality to the light of a dying star, a soft, resigned luminescence that speaks of endings beyond comprehension. I have witnessed 17 such deaths in my lifetime, each one a reminder that even the most ancient and powerful forces in the universe eventually fade into darkness.
But none of those stellar collapses prepared me for what I would witness in the outer reaches, where a different kind of light was dying, the light of hope itself, and where I would learn that some species refuse to let that light extinguish, no matter what the universe demands of them.
I am Thesara Vin, chronicler of final moments for the eternal sovereignty, and I have spent 4,000 years documenting the endings of civilizations. It is a melancholy profession, one that requires a certain detachment from the suffering I witness. I record the last transmissions, preserve the final cultural artifacts, and ensure that when species fade from existence, something of their memory persists in the sovereignty's eternal archives. I have watched empires crumble and species vanish into extinction. I have catalogued the death cries of worlds and the silent fading of civilizations that simply chose to stop existing. I believed, with the certainty of long experience, that I understood every possible variation of ending. I was wrong. The Cathari distress beacon reached us on what should have been an unremarkable day in the 4,847th cycle of our current era. The Cathari were a minor species by sovereignty standards, their civilization barely 8,000 years old, their territory spanning only a handful of systems in the galactic fringe. They had applied for sovereignty membership 3 centuries earlier, and been placed on the standard evaluation period, which typically lasted anywhere from 500 to 2,000 years, depending on developmental trajectory. The distress beacon itself was nothing unusual. Species in crisis sent such signals regularly, and the sovereignty's response protocols were well established. Assessment teams would be dispatched, situation evaluations would be conducted, and appropriate assistance would be rendered if the crisis met certain threshold criteria. It was a system that had functioned efficiently for over 60,000 years. What made the Cathari beacon different was its content. "To any who receive this transmission," the message began, and I remember the voice of the Cathari speaker, a female named Velthrani, their equivalent of a planetary governor. Her voice carried the particular quality of someone who has moved beyond fear into a territory of pure, distilled desperation. "The Void Walkers have come. Our defensive networks have failed. Our fleet is destroyed. We estimate 37 hours until complete planetary extinction. We are transmitting all cultural archives, genetic records, and historical data in the hope that something of our people will survive. We ask, we beg for any assistance, knowing that none can reach us in time. To those who receive this message after our silence, remember us. Remember that we existed, that we dreamed, that we loved. Remember that we tried." The message ended with the coordinates of their homeworld and a series of data packets containing everything the Cathari hoped to preserve of their civilization. Standard procedure for a species facing extinction. I had received similar transmissions hundreds of times throughout my career. What I had never received was what came next. 17 hours into the Cathari's final countdown, our long-range sensors detected something that our analysis systems initially classified as a sensor malfunction. A fleet of vessels had entered the Cathari system, not through any of the standard transit corridors, not using any recognized propulsion signatures, and not matching any ship configurations in our comprehensive databases. The vessels were human. Humanity.
The word still carries weight when I speak it, even now, centuries after the events I am about to describe. In those days, humanity was a footnote in sovereignty records, a young species, barely 3 centuries removed from their first tentative steps into interstellar space. They had been evaluated and categorized as Development Class 7, technologically primitive, territorially insignificant, and culturally unremarkable. Their ships were considered barely functional by sovereignty standards. Their weapons were assessed as ineffective against any serious threat. Their population was negligible, scattered across a handful of colony worlds that most sovereignty cartographers didn't bother to include on standard maps. They were, in every measurable way, irrelevant. And yet, there they were, a fleet of 47 vessels of varying sizes, dropping out of whatever impossible transit method they had employed, positioning themselves between the Cathari homeworld and the approaching Voidwalker Armada. Sovereignty Monitoring Station. This is Captain Elena Vasquez of the United Earth ship Prometheus, came the transmission, clear and calm across frequencies that should not have been able to reach us at that distance. We have received the Cathari distress beacon and are responding. Recommend you adjust your observation protocols. This is about to get interesting. I remember staring at my display screens, unable to process what I was witnessing. The Voidwalkers were an extinction-level threat, entities that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than humanity without apparent effort. Their armada numbered over 300 vessels, each one capable of rendering a planet uninhabitable within hours. They had never been defeated in recorded history. They had never been slowed. And 47 human ships were positioning themselves for direct engagement. "They are committing suicide," my colleague Vereth Sol observed, his chromatic display shifting to the amber patterns that indicated professional assessment. "Their weapons cannot penetrate Voidwalker shielding. Their ships cannot withstand Voidwalker weapons. They will be destroyed within minutes of engagement, and the Cathari will die regardless. It is a pointless gesture." "Perhaps they do not understand what they face," I suggested, though something in the human captain's voice, that calm, controlled confidence, made me doubt my own words. "Perhaps," Vereth Sol agreed. "Young species often overestimate their capabilities. It is a common cause of extinction." We settled in to observe what we both assumed would be a brief, tragic engagement. Another data point in the long history of species that reached beyond their limitations and paid the ultimate price. I prepared recording protocols for the destruction of both the human fleet and the Cathari civilization, ensuring that at least their final moments would be preserved for future analysis. What happened next would fundamentally alter my understanding of reality itself. The human fleet did not attack in the manner we expected. They did not charge toward the Voidwalker Armada in a futile display of courage. Instead, they dispersed, spreading across a volume of space that seemed far too large for their numbers, each vessel moving to precise coordinates that appeared random but carried an underlying pattern that our analysis systems struggled to identify. "What are they doing?" Vereth Sol asked, his chromatic display shifting to confusion patterns. "This formation makes no tactical sense. They are spreading themselves too thin to concentrate firepower." I had no answer. I simply watched as the human vessels reached their positions and then stopped. They hung motionless in space, 47 points of light scattered across the darkness like a constellation that had not existed moments before. The Voidwalkers continued their approach, their vessels moving with the inexorable certainty of an avalanche. They had observed the human fleet's arrival, our sensors confirmed, but had apparently assessed the newcomers as insignificant. Voidwalkers did not alter their attack patterns for minor obstacles. They simply consumed whatever stood in their path. And then Captain Vasquez's voice came across the communication channel again, and I heard something in her tone that I would later come to recognize as the defining characteristic of humanity, a quality that had no direct translation in sovereignty languages.
All ships, this is Prometheus Actual. Concordance protocol is now active. Sync confirmed across all units. On my mark, we show these things what humanity learned in the dark. A pause. A breath. The space between heartbeats. Mark.
What followed was impossible, not improbable, not unexpected, but genuinely impossible according to every physical law and tactical doctrine the sovereignty had accumulated across 60,000 years of galactic observation. The 47 human vessels activated simultaneously, not their weapons, but something else entirely, something that our sensors could not classify because it operated on principles we had never conceived.
A field of energy expanded from each human ship, and where those fields intersected, space itself seemed to fold. The Voidwalker Armada, traveling at velocities that should have carried them to the Cathari homeworld within hours, suddenly found themselves moving in directions they had not chosen. Their formation, so perfect and unstoppable moments before, began to fragment as individual vessels were redirected, displaced, scattered across a volume of space that grew larger with each passing second.
Spatial displacement technology, Varath Sol breathed, his chromatic display shifting through colors I had never seen before, patterns that indicated not just surprise, but fundamental cognitive disruption. They have developed spatial displacement technology? That is not possible. Development Class 7 species cannot.
They have, I interrupted, watching as the Voidwalker Armada, the unstoppable force that had ended civilizations spanning millions of years, was systematically dismantled by 47 vessels crewed by a species we had dismissed as primitive. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours. The human fleet did not destroy the Voidwalkers, they simply removed them from the equation. Each enemy vessel was displaced to coordinates so far from the Cathari system that they would require decades to return. By the time the last Voidwalker was scattered to the cosmic winds, the distress beacon that had been counting down to extinction had fallen silent for an entirely different reason. The Cathari had stopped broadcasting because they no longer needed to. I requested permission to travel to the Cathari system personally, and such was the magnitude of what we had witnessed that my superiors approved the request without the usual bureaucratic delays. I needed to understand what had happened, not just record it, but comprehend it in a way that my 4,000 years of experience had not prepared me for. The journey took 3 standard weeks. When I arrived, I found the Cathari homeworld intact, scarred by the initial Voidwalker assault, but alive, functioning, recovering. Human vessels remained in orbit, their crews assisting with evacuation efforts, medical care, and infrastructure repairs. They had not simply saved the Cathari and departed, they had stayed to help rebuild. I made contact with Captain Vasquez through official diplomatic channels, requesting an interview. Her response came within hours, an invitation to visit the Prometheus directly. The human vessel was not what I expected. Sovereignty ships emphasized elegance, aesthetic beauty, and visible demonstrations of technological advancement. The Prometheus was utilitarian to the point of austerity, every surface designed for function rather than form, every system optimized for practical application rather than impressive display. It was, I realized, the ship of a species that had learned to prioritize survival over appearance. Captain Vasquez met me in what she called the observation lounge, a small chamber with transparent walls that offered a view of the Kethari homeworld below. She was smaller than I had expected, given the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Her physical form was unremarkable by most species standards, bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, covered in the thin membrane that humans called skin. Nothing about her appearance suggested the capability to perform miracles. And yet, she had. "Chronicler Thesara Vin," she said, offering a slight bow that my cultural databases identified as a human gesture of respect. "Thank you for coming. I've read your work. Your preservation of the Velthrani cultural archives was particularly impressive. It's an honor to meet you." I found myself momentarily disoriented. A human had read my work, had formed opinions about it, had apparently considered it worthy of commendation. The cognitive dissonance was substantial. "I came to understand," I said, recovering my composure, "what you accomplished should not have been possible. Your species' technological level, your military capabilities, your experience with threats of this magnitude, none of it suggests the ability to defeat a Voidwalker armada." Captain Vasquez smiled, a human expression that I had learned could indicate many things, but which in this case seemed to convey gentle amusement. "And yet here we are. The Kethari survive, the Voidwalkers are scattered, and your understanding of what's possible has been challenged." "Challenged is an understatement," I admitted. "The sovereignty has observed thousands of species across millions of years. We have developed classification systems that accurately predict technological development, military capability, and crisis response. Humanity was assessed as Development Class 7. Your actions today suggest a capability that should not exist for centuries, perhaps millennia." "Your classification systems are based on observable development," Captain Vasquez replied, gesturing for me to sit in one of the functional chairs that lined the observation chamber. "They measure what we choose to show. They don't account for what we choose to hide." I sat, processing her words. "You deliberately concealed your capabilities? Why?" "Because we've learned what happens to species that appear threatening before they're ready to defend themselves." Her voice remained calm, but something in her eyes, those strange, expressive human eyes, carried depths of meaning that her words did not fully convey. Humanity's history taught us that lesson repeatedly. Those who reveal their strength too soon become targets. Those who wait, who prepare, who build in silence, they survive. "Your history," I said, recognizing an opportunity to understand. "Tell me about your history, Captain. Tell me what shaped a species capable of what I witnessed today." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving to the world beyond the transparent walls, the Kethari homeworld, still bearing the scars of an assault that had nearly ended everything. "We came from a world that tried to kill us," she said finally. "Earth, our homeworld, was not a gentle cradle. It was a testing ground. Our planet's climate shifted repeatedly throughout our evolution, forcing us to adapt or die. Predators hunted us, diseases ravaged us, natural disasters destroyed what we built, again and again. And when we weren't fighting the planet itself, we were fighting each other. Internal conflict is common among developing species," I observed. "Most outgrow it as they mature." "We didn't outgrow it," Captain Vasquez replied. "We learned to channel it. Every war we fought taught us something about strategy, about adaptation, about the will to survive against impossible odds. Every plague that swept through our population taught us about medicine, about research, about the desperate creativity that emerges when there's no other choice.
Every disaster that leveled our cities taught us about resilience, about rebuilding, about refusing to accept that destruction was permanent. She turned to face me directly, and I saw in her expression the echo of countless generations of struggle. By the time we reached the stars, we had been forged by 10,000 years of continuous crisis. We had learned that survival is not something that happens to you, it's something you fight for, moment by moment, generation by generation. And we learned to never, ever assume that because something seems impossible, it actually is.
The spatial displacement technology, I said, beginning to understand. You developed it despite lacking the theoretical foundations that our models suggest are necessary.
We developed it because we needed it, she confirmed, 3 centuries ago when we first detected signals indicating intelligent life in the galaxy. We also detected evidence of the threats that existed, the Void Walkers, the Harvesters, the Silent Ones. We knew that we were small, young, and vulnerable. And we knew that if we followed the expected development path, we would be extinct before we ever had a chance to grow.
So you innovated.
So we focused. Every resource we could spare went into research and development. Not the kind that produces visible results, not grand ships or impressive weapons, but the kind that produces fundamental breakthroughs. We studied physics at levels that your sovereignty's established institutions had declared fully understood. We found gaps in that understanding. We exploited them. The sovereignty's scientific assessments concluded that spatial displacement technology was theoretically impossible without certain prerequisite developments, I said. Developments that humanity has not demonstrated. Captain Vasquez's smile returned, but this time it carried something harder, a hint of the steel that had allowed 47 ships to defeat 300. We didn't develop those prerequisites because we found a different path. Your scientists assumed there was only one way to achieve spatial displacement. They were wrong. There are many ways, some of them easier than others if you're willing to look at the problem from angles that established wisdom says are impossible. And you were willing. We had no choice. Established wisdom said we would be extinct before we matured. Established wisdom said the Void Walkers were unstoppable. Established wisdom said 47 ships couldn't save a dying world. She gestured toward the Cathari homeworld below. Established wisdom was wrong. I sat in silence, absorbing the implications of what she was telling me. The sovereignty had spent 60,000 years developing comprehensive models of galactic development. Those models were based on observation, on evidence, on the accumulated experience of thousands of civilizations. They were considered definitive. And a species barely 3 centuries old had proven them inadequate. Why did you come? I asked finally. The Cathari distress beacon was broadcast on standard emergency frequencies. Humanity is not part of the sovereignty's mutual defense protocols. You had no obligation to respond. Captain Vasquez turned away from the window, and something in her expression shifted, the hardness giving way to something softer, something that my emotional analysis systems struggled to classify.
Because we heard them, she said simply. We heard their cry for help, and we were capable of answering. That is not a sufficient explanation, I pressed. Many species are capable of rendering assistance in crises. Most do not, unless there is strategic advantage or treaty obligation. What made the Cathari worthy of your intervention? Worthy? Captain Vasquez's voice carried something that might have been surprise or perhaps disappointment. They were dying. They were calling for help. They were sentient beings facing extinction, and they had done nothing to deserve that fate. What more worthiness is required? The sovereignty's intervention protocols require assessment of strategic value,
resource cost, and probability of success before any.
With respect, Chronicler, your sovereignty's protocols are why the Cathari almost died. Her voice remained calm, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath the words. Your assessment teams were still debating intervention criteria while the countdown to extinction continued. Your evaluation committees were still calculating resource costs while cities burned. Your probability analyses concluded that assistance was futile, so no assistance was offered.
The analysis was accurate, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. By any reasonable assessment, intervention was impossible.
Reasonable assessment. Captain Vasquez's tone made the phrase sound like an accusation. Reasonable assessment said the Voidwalkers couldn't be stopped. Reasonable assessment said 47 ships couldn't make a difference. Reasonable assessment would have let 17 billion sentient beings die because the mathematics suggested saving them was impractical.
And yet you came anyway.
We came because we don't use reasonable assessment to determine whether people deserve to live. She stepped closer, and despite her smaller stature, I found myself fighting the urge to step back. We came because hope doesn't require mathematical validation. We came because somewhere in human history, we learned that the moment you start calculating whether suffering is worth addressing, you've already lost something essential about what it means to be civilized.
But the risk, I began.
Was ours to take, she interrupted. 47 crews volunteered for this mission knowing that our technology was untested against a threat of this magnitude. 47 crews decided that the chance to save 17 billion lives was worth the risk of losing a few thousand. That's not recklessness, that's mathematics of a different kind.
I had no response. 4,000 years of documenting endings, of recording the last moments of dying civilizations, had not prepared me for this, for a species that simply refused to accept that endings were inevitable.
The distress beacon faded, I said finally, recalling the moment when the Cathari transmission had finally ceased. Your ships appeared just as the beacon reached its final moments.
We arrived as quickly as we could, Captain Vasquez confirmed. Our drive technology is fast, but not instantaneous. We heard the beacon at its peak and traveled as fast as our ships could carry us. When we arrived, the beacon was failing, not because the Cathari had been destroyed, but because their power systems were failing. They had poured everything they had into that cry for help, and they had almost nothing left.
And yet you still came, even knowing you might be too late.
Better to arrive too late than never to arrive at all. Her expression softened slightly. And in this case, we weren't too late. The beacon faded, but the Cathari survived. That's what matters.
I remained on the Prometheus for several days, observing the human crew as they continued their assistance operations. What struck me most was not their technology, though that was indeed remarkable, but their behavior. They worked alongside the Cathari as equals, not as superiors bestowing gifts upon inferiors. They shared meals, exchanged stories, and formed the kinds of connections that the sovereignty's protocols specifically discouraged between evaluation species and candidate civilizations.
You treat them as friends, I observed to Lieutenant Commander James Okafor, one of the Prometheus's senior officers, as he helped coordinate medical supply distribution.
"They're friends," he replied, as if this were the most obvious thing in the universe. "Or they will be, once we have time to know each other properly. Right now, they're people who need help. That's enough to start with."
The sovereignty maintains protocols of distance between evaluation species and candidate civilizations, I explained. Such relationships are considered to compromise objectivity.
Lieutenant Commander Okafor paused in his work, giving me a long, thoughtful look. With respect, Chronicler,
Your sovereignty has been evaluating species for 60,000 years. In that time, how many have you actually saved?
The question struck me with unexpected force. I knew the answer. I had access to the complete records of sovereignty intervention decisions across our entire history. The number of species that had been saved through direct intervention was lower than I had ever consciously considered.
"We preserve their memories," I said, aware of how inadequate the words sounded. "We ensure that their existence is not forgotten."
"Memories don't raise children," Lieutenant Commander Okafor said quietly. "Memories don't build cities or write poems or fall in love. Memories don't hope for tomorrow." He gestured toward a group of Cathari children who were watching human medics treat their injured parents, their wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and wonder. "Those children will grow up. They will have children of their own. They will remember that, when everything seemed lost, strangers came from the stars to help them survive. That memory will shape who they become, who their entire civilization becomes."
You believe that is more valuable than objective observation?
I believe that observation without action is just watching people die with extra steps. His voice carried no accusation, only a kind of profound sadness. Your sovereignty has 60,000 years of observations. How many of those observations could have been interventions instead?
I had no answer. I was beginning to suspect that I had no answers for any of the questions that humanity's presence was raising.
On the 7th day of my observation, I witnessed something that would fundamentally alter my understanding of what humanity represented.
A second Voidwalker armada had been detected, larger than the first, approaching from a different vector. The scattered remnants of the initial force had apparently communicated with others of their kind, and the response was swift and terrible. Over 500 vessels were converging on the Cathari system, far more than the 47 human ships could handle through spatial displacement alone.
I expected the humans to evacuate, to save as many Cathari as their ships could carry, and flee before the unstoppable force arrived. It was the only logical response. Their miracle had bought time, but time had run out.
Instead, Captain Vasquez called a fleet-wide assembly. "You all know what's coming," she said, her voice broadcast to every human vessel in the system. "You all know the numbers. 500 plus against 47. Our displacement technology can handle maybe a third of that before our power systems fail. After that, it's conventional weapons against an enemy that has never been defeated in conventional combat."
She paused, and I watched the faces of the human crew around me. Young and old, male and female, every shade of human coloring represented. They showed no fear. They showed no hesitation. They showed only a kind of grim, determined readiness that made my analytical systems struggle to categorize what I was witnessing.
"Earth Command has given us permission to withdraw," Captain Vasquez continued. "No one would blame us for leaving. We've already accomplished the impossible once. Walking away now would be reasonable."
She let the word hang in the air, reasonable, and I remembered our earlier conversation.
But 17 billion people are still on that planet. 17 billion people who will die if we leave. 17 billion people who trusted us to protect them when no one else would. Her voice hardened. I will not leave them. I cannot order any of you to stay, but I will not leave.
The response was immediate and unanimous. Every human in the fleet, every single one, volunteered to stay. There was no hesitation, no debate, no calculation of odds or assessment of survival probability. They simply chose to remain.
"Very well," Captain Vasquez said, And something in her voice, pride perhaps, or love, made me understand that this response had been expected. Then let's show the Voidwalkers what happens when they threaten people under humanity's protection. What followed was unlike any battle in sovereignty records.
The human fleet did not simply fight, they adapted. When their spatial displacement technology reached its limits, they switched to weapons and tactics that seemed to change moment by moment. They exploited weaknesses in the Voidwalker formations that no previous combatant had identified. They coordinated with a precision that suggested not just communication, but shared consciousness, each vessel anticipating what the others would do before they did it. And when individual ships were damaged beyond combat effectiveness, their crews did not surrender or flee. They aimed their crippled vessels at critical targets and continued fighting until there was nothing left to fight with.
18 human ships were destroyed in the engagement. 18 crews, over 3,000 humans, gave their lives to protect a species they had known for less than 2 weeks. They died not for their own people, not for strategic advantage, not for any gain that rational assessment could identify. They died because strangers needed protection, and they were capable of providing it. When the battle ended, when the Voidwalker armada had been broken and scattered, their remnants fleeing toward the void between galaxies, I found Captain Vasquez standing alone in the observation lounge, staring at the stars. 3,000 of your people? I said quietly, not wanting to intrude but needing to understand. They died for species that are not their own?
They died for people who needed them, she replied, her voice heavy with grief that she made no effort to hide. Every one of them knew the risk. Every one of them chose to stay anyway. That's who we are, Chronicler. That's what humanity means.
Your species has existed for such a short time. How can you afford such losses?
We can't. She turned to face me, and I saw tears, the human expression of grief tracking down her face. We feel every single death. We mourn every single loss. We carry the weight of every sacrifice for as long as we live. She paused, composing herself with visible effort. But that weight is the price of being who we choose to be. If we turned away from suffering because helping might cost us something, we would become something less than human. And that is a cost we refuse to pay.
I returned to sovereignty space with recordings that would reshape our understanding of development classification, crisis intervention, and the nature of civilizational advancement. The sovereignty's leadership watched my documentation with reactions ranging from skepticism to profound disturbance.
They cannot be Development Class 7, High Arbiter Valeneth Prime declared after reviewing my evidence. Their technology, their tactics, their very philosophy, none of it matches our assessment criteria. Perhaps our assessment criteria are inadequate, I suggested, words that would have been considered heretical mere weeks before.
60,000 years of observation, Valeneth Prime countered. Thousands of species assessed, categorized, and validated. Our models have never failed.
They have never encountered humanity, I replied, and I suspect that humanity represents something our models were never designed to accommodate.
Which is?
I considered the question carefully, drawing on everything I had witnessed during my time among the humans. Our models assume that development follows predictable patterns, that technology advances through established stages, that civilizational maturity requires certain prerequisites, that behavior can be extrapolated from observable factors. Humanity does not follow these patterns. They do not develop according to our expectations because they are not constrained by our assumptions about what is possible.
That is not an explanation, Valeneth Prime objected. That is a description of anomalous behavior.
It is more than that, I insisted. Humanity has learned, through millennia of struggle, crisis, and survival, that the universe does not care about expectations. They have internalized a philosophy that our models cannot account for, that impossibility is not a fact but a challenge, that desperation is not a weakness but a catalyst, that hope is not naivety but a choice to fight for something better regardless of the odds.
Irrational, Valaneth Prime concluded. Such an approach will eventually lead to their destruction.
Perhaps, I acknowledged. But before that destruction comes, they will accomplish things that rational species would never attempt. They will save civilizations that probability suggests cannot be saved. They will answer distress beacons that fade into silence, arriving too late according to any reasonable assessment, and somehow, impossibly, make a difference anyway.
I paused, remembering the human ships appearing just as hope seemed lost, remembering Captain Vasquez's calm voice cutting through the static of a dying beacon, remembering 3,000 lives given freely to protect strangers.
The Cathari sent a distress beacon, knowing that no help could reach them in time. The galaxy's reasonable species ignored that beacon because intervention was impractical. The beacon faded, power systems failing, hope extinguishing moment by moment. I met Velanath Prime's gaze directly. And then human ships appeared.
Not because intervention was practical, not because the mathematics favored success, but because 17 billion lives hung in the balance, and humanity refused to accept that as an acceptable loss.
They risked everything for strangers.
They did more than risk, I corrected. They gave. 3,000 humans died protecting the Cathari. They knew the odds, they knew the danger, and they stayed anyway. That is not irrational. That is the most rational choice possible for a species that has decided what kind of civilization they want to be. The sovereignty's response to my report was significant. Intervention protocols were revised for the first time in 15,000 years. Development classification criteria were expanded to include factors that had previously been dismissed as unmeasurable, and a formal embassy was established with humanity, the first time in sovereignty history that such recognition had been extended to a species less than 500 years removed from their homeworld. I was appointed as the sovereignty's first ambassador to humanity, a role that I have held for the past century. In that time, I have watched humans continue to do impossible things, saving species on the verge of extinction, solving problems that ancient civilizations had declared unsolvable, and consistently demonstrating that the universe's constraints are more flexible than established wisdom suggests. They have also, I have learned, been extending their protection far beyond what even I initially understood. The fleet that saved the Cathari was not an isolated response. It was part of a systematic effort to monitor distress beacons across the galaxy, responding to any cry for help regardless of origin, distance, or political complication. We call it the Lighthouse Initiative. Captain Vasquez, now Admiral Vasquez, explained during one of my regular visits to Earth. Every species that achieves spaceflight eventually faces a crisis that threatens extinction. We can't save everyone, but we can make sure that no one dies simply because help wasn't available. The resource requirements must be staggering, I observed. They are. We allocate nearly 12% of our entire economic output to the initiative. Ships, training, technology development, rapid response infrastructure, all of it designed around a single purpose, answering when someone calls for help. And your people accept this cost? My people demanded it.
Her voice carried the peculiar mix of pride and humility that I had come to recognize as distinctly human. When we first detected evidence of galactic civilization, we also detected evidence of how often that civilization fails those in need. We saw distress beacons go unanswered. We saw extinction events that could have been prevented. We saw suffering that continued because intervention was impractical. We decided that we would be different.
And if the cost eventually becomes too great? If your people tire of sacrifice?
Admiral Vasquez smiled, older now, marked by decades of command and loss and victory, but still carrying that same fire that I had witnessed in a young captain facing impossible odds. Every generation, we tell our children the story of the Cathari. We tell them about a distress beacon that faded into silence, about a species facing extinction while the galaxy watched and did nothing. And we tell them about 47 ships that appeared at the last possible moment, about 3,000 lives given freely to save strangers, about the choice we made to be the kind of civilization that answers when someone screams for help. She looked out the window of her office, toward the stars that had once seemed so hostile and were now, thanks in no small part to human intervention, slightly less dangerous. "As long as we tell that story," she said quietly, "we will never tire of sacrifice. Because that story is who we are. That story is who we choose to be, generation after generation, no matter the cost."
I have lived for over 4,000 years. I have documented the endings of countless civilizations and preserved the memories of species that no longer exist. I have witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of stars, the endless cycle of creation and destruction that defines existence in this universe. And in all that time, I have never encountered anything quite like humanity.
They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. Others possess greater military power, more advanced technology, longer histories of achievement. They are not the wisest. Their youth means they still make mistakes that older civilizations learned to avoid millennia ago. They are not the most elegant, the most sophisticated, or the most advanced by any standard measure. But they are the only species I have ever encountered that defines itself by its willingness to answer impossible calls for help. They are the only species that has looked at the universe's indifference and responded not with acceptance, but with defiance. They are the only species that has built an entire civilization around the principle that no cry for help should go unanswered, no matter how faint, no matter how distant, no matter how impossible the odds. The distress beacon faded. Every species in the galaxy heard it. Every species assessed the situation, calculated the odds, and concluded that intervention was impractical. Every species except one. Human ships appeared, not because the odds favored them, not because they had anything to gain, not because treaty or obligation demanded their presence. They appeared because strangers were dying and help was needed, and for humanity, that was enough. That is the story of how I learned what humanity truly represents. Not power, not technology, not strategic advantage, but something far more fundamental. They represent the choice to care when caring is costly. They represent the decision to act when action is difficult. They represent hope, not as naive optimism, but as deliberate defiance of a universe that seems designed to crush it. The distress beacon faded. Human ships appeared. And the galaxy was never the same.